Hi, everyone. Welcome to Generous Futures, Demanding Climate Justice. My name is Valerie Pringle. I apologize for this laryngitis. I hope it's not too irritating listening to me today. I'm a proud alumna of Ryerson, really interested in this topic, delighted to be here today with this really exceptional panel of people we've got to talk to this issue. So they'll be talking a lot more than I am, but just to introduce, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement. TMU is located in Toronto in the Dish with One Spoon territory. Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabeg, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee. It's bound them to share the territory with each other and share the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations, as well as Europeans and all newcomers, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace and friendship and respect. Today's discussion is very much embedded into this national conversation that we're having about land stewardship and reciprocity, decolonization, and these issues will certainly come forward today. So just to begin, I'd like to thank very much TD Bank Group for helping bring Generous Futures and this whole series, which has been going on for a while and will continue, to all of you. In 2022, the TD Ready Challenge focused on how climate change and the transition to a low carbon economy disproportionately affects different groups and communities. And in a follow-up email that you're going to get, we're going to share information about some of the TD grant recipients who are leading in this space. So, we all know why we're here. This issue obviously matters to all of us, but I think the sort of defining question that we're going to try and deal with today is where to from here? Where do we go from here? How do we advance this? So the plan for the next 45 minutes is pretty straightforward. We're going to hear from the panelists, less from me, have a conversation with them. Then we'll do our best to get to your questions if you want to submit them through the chat function. We've received a few in advance anyway, so we'll get to some of your questions as well. So let's get to the panel, who all have wonderful voices. First is Devika Shah, who is Executive Director of the Environment Funders of Canada, which is a network of over 75 funders responding to environmental crises through innovative solutions. She is passionate about nurturing systems change solutions grounded in regenerative economic development, social justice, equity, and active democratic engagement. So there you are. Welcome, Devika. And Eric Saint-Pierre is the Executive Director of the Trottier Foundation, where he oversees grant making and programs, new initiatives, investments. He's spoken extensively about issues related to philanthropy and climate change, and has played a leading role in bringing Low Carbon Cities Canada initiative to life and developing Montreal's initiative and commitment to reduce emissions by 55%. And before joining the foundation, Eric practiced Indigenous and environmental law. So welcome, Eric. And I guess she was first known as the girl who silenced the world for 5 minutes. Severn Cullis-Suzuki was appointed to the Earth Charter Commission as a teenager. And while she was studying evolutionary biology at Yale, she spearheaded Power Shift, which was a cycling trip across Canada for clean air. In 2002, she was a special advisor to the Secretary General for the World Summit on Sustainable Development. She was a founding member of the Haida Gwaii Higher Education Society, and in 2021, Severn became executive director of the David Suzuki Foundation. And I guess has been celebrating watching her dad do his final epic program, hosting Nature of Things, which, is an astonishing achievement. Anyway, welcome. And finally, Lauren Johnson has more than 20 years experience in forging solutions to sustainability challenges. Early in his career, he played a leadership role in establishing the Forest Stewardship Council, served as his executive director at World Wildlife Fund Canada. He led partnerships with several forest products companies, governments, and ocean conservation groups. He's been a leading voice for Clean Economy Fund, the Cornerstone Standards Council, Efficiency Canada, and the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement Secretariat. He's been very busy. In addition to his work with the Ivy Foundation, he's also an advisor to the Shad Foundation. So welcome, Lauren. Now this is good because I'm going to pass it over to you. And I'm going to start with a question for all of you and sort of move through, in a pattern. If you could just sort of address it in a minute or so, which is not easy because it's a big question, but to set the stage here. So I'll start with David Kaz. Why is climate a justice issue?
Yeah, so I think any societal problem is automatically a justice issue because there's a massive discrepancy in how the negative impacts of any of those issues are felt by different groups. So if you think about issues like COVID, housing, mental health, precarious work, crime, no matter what the issue, we don't need to provide tons of research to show that it's low-income, Black, Indigenous, people of color, people with disabilities, who are the ones who experience those issues in ways that are far more damaging to their survival and their health and their well-being than others. And so climate is really no different than any of those other issues. It actually belongs in the exact same bucket. Recently I was in conversations with people from the United Way, for example. Their focus is poverty reduction and community well-being, but they are starting to realize that the impacts of climate change will make the work that they do right now way much harder. And so, we're talking about safety, security, costs associated with floods and droughts. We're talking about the health issues like heat stress and air pollution, water quality, death from just the heat. We're talking about a shrinking public purse to deliver core services. And we're talking about jobs. If Canada's left out of the global clean energy economy and we don't move at the pace and scale of our neighbors to the south, there will be jobs lost. So for all of those reasons, it's very much a justice issue.
Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Valerie, for having me on. So for me, climate is a justice issue because the impacts of climate change are not being felt equally or fairly between rich and poor, women and men, communities of color, older, younger generations. Climate is a threat to everyone, but some groups, socially and economically disadvantaged, and often communities of color face the greatest risks. So Devika touched up on heat. So we're seeing heat waves exacerbating health inequalities amongst Indigenous communities, such as the deadly heat dome in British Columbia that literally destroyed entire communities. Extreme weather events, we're seeing disadvantaged communities that often lack healthcare, they lack transportation options, or their housing is very precarious. We saw last year with the flooding and displacements in Pakistan, those who have contributed the very least to climate change are actually paying the biggest price. So for me, climate injustice means that communities who contributed the least to climate change or contributed the least in terms of greenhouse gas emissions are actually the ones that are suffering the worst in terms of loss and damages. Last year at COP27 in Egypt, the concept of loss and damages, which has been around for quite some time, started to gain some more traction. And that's essentially the idea that rich countries like Canada, we ought to be paying the cost and the harm caused to other parts of the world. So this is why I believe that climate and justice are interconnected.
Severn.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that. So there's many aspects of justice inherent in climate change. Basically, climate change has been caused by the few in a short period of time, and it has transformed the lives of all humans now and forever in our future, as well as the lives of all life forms on Earth. The injustice of this is just inherent to the issue, and it's a huge part of the climate change is a huge part of the 6th mass extinction event that's now underway on Earth. So the profound unfairness of all of these aspects is profound, and I very much hear and agree with what's being said. One more additional point. Within our societies, very much like we just saw with COVID-19, climate change exacerbates all injustices, all prejudices, wealth inequities, gender prejudices, because it's increasing instability in our world. It's increasing violence. And of course, it increases the harm to those most at risk, who are always women, children, those of equity-seeking groups, equity-deserving groups. And we're plunging into a time when that is further exacerbated by climate change.
Lauren. Oh, Lauren. Mike,
Thanks for waving your hands, Valerie. I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. Yeah, it's hard to really improve upon what's being said, and I'm no expert on this. I happen to be married to a woman who is, my wife is Natalie Shellifor, who is at the University of Ottawa and just does work on, specializes in work on climate justice and equity. And so just through pillow talk, it's become very internalized in my head that, to put it crassly, if you're a suburban or urban wealthy family, you will be far less impacted by a whole range of climate-driven events, for example, whether they're tick-borne illness, extreme weather events, ice storms, droughts, heat waves. You'll be far less impacted than if you are a rural, lower-income Indigenous woman, and like just hands down. And I think Devika said it well. I'm still mispronouncing your name, Devika. I'm just going to go back to my old pronunciation. It's true that all disruptions have a strong justice component. I actually argue that climate change is a little unique and Severin alluded to this a bit about just given the scale of the disruption that's happening, the massive impacts on biodiversity, on economic disruption, social disruption, health. And so it's sort of the Uber disruptor out there. And so the distributional impacts are massive in a way that we haven't seen with other issues. It just touches on so many aspects of life.
I have questions, excuse me, again, my voice, for all of you, but it'd be great if anybody wants to weigh in and join in that discussion. First for Devika, you're leading and talking to all these funders. Have you noticed a change in the conversation, in the questions that have been asked over the last few years, and how funders are looking at this, and whether they're interested in leading change or how things are changing?
Yeah, thanks, Valerie. Yes, there's no question about it. There is definitely a shift and a change underway in the funding world. But before answering it, I just want to provide some context that I think is relevant to this conversation. So the first piece of it is that the climate funding that's available within the philanthropic sector is not very much to begin with. The percentage is growing. We're in the process of trying to figure out what that number actually is today. But historically, the most recent number everyone has been working with is 2%. Looking at the US, Australia, the UK, my guess is that today's number is going to be closer to about 6%. But that's for the greatest existential crisis that our species has ever faced. So, I just want to put that in context. And then, within that available funding, I would say that historically, and this is also very true today, the majority of the resources that we do have are focused on inside game, what I call inside game strategies. So researching and modeling solutions that will hopefully create a different policy and regulatory environment, or that will attract injections of cash from government or the private sector to build different types of infrastructure, whether we're talking about greening electricity grids or building codes, or upgrading building codes or EV infrastructure, and working with various economic sectors to explore technological innovation, piloting solutions. That's been where a lot of the energy is. Very little of the funding that is going out today is actually devoted to what I call outside game strategies. So the parts of the solutions that really involve people and bringing people on board, because regardless of what the public opinion polls are showing, the reality is we still operate in an environment where every time the political pendulum swings from one government to another, the one government puts some good policies in and the next one comes and uproots it. So we don't yet have a public that is holding politicians of whatever stripe within a narrow set of boundaries when it comes to environmental issues, so that they can't move very far regardless of where they are on the spectrum. We're still at the stage of people thinking environmental action is about, you know, paper straws and upgrading appliances. Not that that's not good, but we're not yet at the stage of really holding politicians to account. So in terms of, you know, where the funding is going, I really do think there's a massive imbalance in the resources applied to inside game versus outside game. Building power is an absolute prerequisite, and the fact that we've given it so little attention over the past 40 years within the environmental movement, and funders are a part of that, is why we aren't further ahead. So what does that all have to do with climate justice? I don't think climate justice is an area of work per se. It's not a special, distinct thing. It is actually a lens that needs to be applied to everything, whether it's inside game or outside game. So how are we doing? You know, we've been slow to catch up to other sectors. And I think part of the reason, but we are catching up. But I think part of the reason we've been slow is there's this underlying mental model that needs to be upgraded. And, you know, the mental model is that justice is the moral thing to do, and we should feel guilty, and we should do it because that's where the world is going, and we're bad if we don't, versus a mental model of it's actually the most strategic thing we can do. Like, we simply cannot win if we don't. So for me, you know, issues of equity and justice are something that are woven into every piece of environmental work I do, but unfortunately, that is sometimes misinterpreted as not focusing enough on the environment. So, you know, we're EFC and we should be focused on the environment, and other groups can focus on equity, but that's just not strategic. Obviously, I do care about those issues for moral reasons, but the issues that keep me up at night are environmental issues. First and foremost, I've been in the movement for 15 years, and you know, with a pure strategic mindset, looking down the road, we will not meet our emissions targets. We will not meet our conservation targets if we don't apply a climate justice lens to everything we do. But we are catching up. Like, EFC as a member organization for environmental funders is a really good signal of where the movement, the funding movement is going. We released a strategic plan that does exactly that embeds climate justice in all the issues that we work on. And funders are starting to shift. They're starting to fund different types of actors. They're beginning to track who they're funding to try to address imbalances. They're shifting to trust-based philanthropy. There's a different kind of receptiveness to the issues that we're talking about today than there has been before. I mean, a person like me would have never been in this role 10 years ago, hands down. So there is a shift, and it's created an openness to moving in the right direction.
Thank you. And one of the shifts, and Eric, I don't know if you can speak to this, is an accumulation, you know, of science and evidence in terms of what is happening. If anybody had any doubts, you know, you guys obviously didn't. It was incontrovertible. But I just wonder if you can talk about, you know, how that evidence is shaping investment in climate.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the evidence and science behind climate change is unequivocal, and you know, we're really finding ourselves in a situation of urgency, and Devika really mentioned that. We're currently at a 1.2 scenario, and we're about to hit 1.5 Celsius, like within the potentially the end of this decade. Like, that's absolutely nuts. So for me, like, there's an emerging sense of crisis. So the question is, are we seeing investments meeting this crisis? And I don't think so. I think there are signs of hope. I'm going to run through that. So we're seeing a sense of urgency, but we're not seeing real dollars attributed to that. So Devika was talking about the philanthropic funding, and ClimateWorks had a report that showed that only 2% of global philanthropy is addressing the most important crisis in this planet. Canadian arts funders, 8% of art funding in Canada is going to the arts, and there's no links whatsoever to climate. 30% of philanthropic dollars are going towards the healthcare system in Canada, and there are no single health and climate funders in Canada. So we have to do a better job of making those connections and linking the arts and climate, linking health and climate, because it's all connected. So there are signs of hope, and kudos to Environmental Funders Canada for taking on the Canadian philanthropic commitment on climate change. So that's trying to mobilize a lot of different foundations around climate. But really for me, the question is, where are the other funders? So this is something that Lauren and I talk about regularly, and other funders. It's a small, lonely space, and we're trying to really increase investments in this space. We are seeing investments slowly trickle in, which is motivating. And we're also seeing a lot of interest in the investment piece in terms of assets. So in terms of ESG investing or impact investing, shareholder engagement, I think we're seeing a diversity of foundations taking an interest there. But even if we had, loads of money from foundations, if we went up to 25% of philanthropy addressing the climate crisis, it would still be a drop in the bucket in terms of the crisis itself. So I think ultimately we need governments. So we need governments to massively invest. The good news is that we're seeing governments invest in climate change. While it wasn't perfect, the last budget last month in Ottawa actually invested quite heavily in clean electricity and the clean economy. We've seen a lot of reports. Actually, there's one from Severn's organization at the David Suzuki Foundation and others that identify that we need 2 or 3 times more electricity or clean electricity if we're going to meet a net zero economy. So there are really good investments. It's probably less interesting. People aren't reading the details of potential deductions that could be made for renewable energy companies, but there's a lot of investments being made by the federal government. The USA has also invested massively with the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's going to really change systems in the US and have impacts here in Canada. But that being said, we still need to drastically increase our ambition. We need to accelerate and scale climate solutions. We really need to get communities off natural gas. We need to drastically accelerate heat pumps and renewables, electrify all of our buildings and the transportation sector. We also need to stop fossil fuel subsidies. We need to put a cap on oil and gas emissions and so much more. So we talk about governments, but we also need to put pressure on the finance sector, which also has far more money than a group of foundations can have. So I think there's an important role for pension funds. And the pension fund sector is moving, but potentially not fast enough. So we're seeing a large number of Canadian pension funds, for example, committing to net zero, committing up to $1.8 trillion towards sustainable investments, but only about 270 billion of that is actually going towards sustainable investments. So about 13% of that commitment is being met, and we need to be at 20%, or we need to be at higher. So there's a lot of commitments, commitments on paper, but real investments is slow to trickle in. And likewise with banks, we're seeing some commitments with banks, and some are progressive and some are moving more quickly than others. But we need to drastically increase the scale to really move the needle. So overall, I think we're seeing really promising signs of bold investment in the climate space. And this keeps me really encouraged and really motivated. But we actually need a lot more, and we need it really quickly.
Thank you. Severn, the Suzuki Foundation has been sort of on the forefront of activism, social change for obviously a very long time. One piece that we haven't talked about yet is the sort of complex relationship between biodiversity, and the climate and what we're talking about, in addition to reconciliation, land claims, and equity. Can you just sort of speak to that and maybe just touch on the issue of what funders, if there are some listening, should or shouldn't be doing?
Sure. Well, that's a big question. I just wanted to follow up on what Eric was speaking to, just about things starting to mobilize. And one of the things that I think is really interesting to consider is that we just saw what it looked like to have an emergency response to an existential crisis. We just saw governments of the world work across party lines. We saw billions moved every month. We just saw what it meant to change our lives drastically, to live and listen to science. We just saw what that looks like, and we succeeded in preventing huge death, huge terrible extreme consequences of the global pandemic with COVID-19. And we just did that. So the question is not, can we respond? Can we do this? Can we coordinate? It's, are we going to choose to? And so all of these things that were just mentioned by Eric, all these different strategies for putting pressure, they're so critical to getting us to essentially an emergency response, a real emergency response. And so many different governments municipally, but even federal governments have announced that they're in a climate emergency, and yet we're not acting like that. And we just saw what a real emergency response was. Another caveat there is, emergencies also are times when civil liberties are suppressed and when a lot of harms happen, especially to equity-seeking groups. So we have to be really careful in that space to make sure that the conversation about justice is really upheld. And I agree so wholeheartedly with what Devika said about, we're not going to make it to a sustainable way of being. We're not going to, address climate change without the justice lens. It's key to the answer. So back to your question, DSF has been working on the forefront of activism. One of the things that, we really have to come to terms with as an environmental movement, and now climate change is really causing us to look at this reality, is the environmental movement it came out of a Western colonial society and hasn't considered the people whose land we're on, who have stewarded this land, especially in Canada for millennia, for well over 10,000 years. And so right now, as we're in this big social turn that has happened, through the pandemic, through the violence that erupted, that really came into light with George Floyd's murder, and with the unearthing of children's bones here in Canada besides residential school. I mean, we're in this very big social awakening. We are really coming into terms as an environmental movement with the fact that we have to pay respect to and listen and allow to and support leadership of Indigenous worldviews in order to address climate change. It's really, really important. And as the solutions do come forward and then get implemented across the world, we're seeing one example is nature-based solutions. We have to make sure that we're taking into consideration these other worldviews and making sure that justice is forefront, because we don't want to perpetuate the same problems. And I think it's attributed to Einstein, the quote that, the definition of insanity is to continue to apply the same philosophy to try to find solutions, but using the same mentality as the problems. Sorry, I butchered that quote, but we can't keep on using the same practices to try to find the solutions. We need to look at things in a different way. And one of the things that I've been really listening to in Indigenous communities that are addressing climate change are realizing or bringing forward the reality that climate change is just actually a symptom. Ecosystem breakdown, these are just symptoms. They're symptoms of a human mindset that is destroying all of our future, a colonial, capitalist, and a white supremacy culture mindset. And this kind of conjunction has really set the perfect conditions for a fossil fuel supremacy. And this is what we're in fact living in, a fossil fuel supremacy world where the concept and ideology that fossil fuels, cars, roads are, really just these are the best ways, these are the only ways, and these are the inevitable aspects of progress and civilization. And that's what we've been kind of, enculturated to believe that, and this is what the fossil fuel industry really wants us to continue to believe. So we really have to face that. And luckily for us, this is not the only way of being. We live in a country with so much diversity of cultures, and Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also around the world, offer us a different mental framework, a different cultural framework that shows that, in fact, there are so many other living examples of ways to live with the earth, ways to, in fact, enhance ecosystems. And therein lies so much hope. And I think we have to really, especially with our children, we have to start finding those examples to show that actually humans are the answer to our biggest problems.
Thank you. Lauren, sorry, here I go. Sorry, laryngitis. Can you speak to the government piece? I mean, Eric alluded to that. How do we get governments focused? What can funders do in that regard? Do people have to lead this, or do we have to rely on governments too?
Again, I want to pick up just on part of the last question that you posed to Severin, which is the connection to conservation, and is there anything to be learned from that? And I've been in this work for 30 odd years now. Half of it was working on forest conservation, and a big chunk of that was working from a philanthropy perspective in working with foundations. And I would just comment that 20 years ago, the notion of funding Indigenous organizations and communities to build their capacity to do land use plans, land use studies, to develop Indigenous guardians programs was a radical idea. There was, I mean, might not have been a radical idea to David Suzuki and to a few others, but it was a fairly radical idea. There weren't that many funders that were actually active in this space. Weirdly, Pew Charitable Trust in the US was one of the earliest. And I would say if you cast forward to today, I'll be so bold to say the bulk of the conservation granting, I'm not talking about ag granting for conservation and private land work, but for kind of conservation work that leads to Indigenous protected areas, et cetera. The vast majority of that funding today goes to Indigenous-led projects that are community-led land use planning projects. And it went from being something that was seen by philanthropy as a nice thing to do and the right thing to do, to an acknowledgement today, I would say, by almost every foundation that I know that works in this space, that you don't do conservation work in Canada and you can't get it done without Indigenous leadership. And that is a change, and I think it is a cause for hope. And it's hard to find a government. There's a couple in this country who aren't mostly leading with Indigenous protected areas. Saskatchewan is, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland. There's a few others, Ontario and Alberta, that aren't there yet, but even some of the more conservative, and I mean small c conservative governments, are actually starting to get their head around this and realizing that you can't do this without Indigenous leadership, and they're in the driver's seat.
Government.
So, what's that?
I said government.
Yeah, I know, government. Okay. The question that was posed, you kind of paraphrased it, Valerie, was kind of greatest challenges and promising directions for government. First and foremost, I think, as everybody knows, there is no more wicked problem or no better example of a kind of a tragedy of the commons than climate change. And so this is not going to be solved by individual action and consumers and households. It's not going to be solved by business and voluntary standards. There is a clear and obvious role for government to play. And we've had 30 years of alarm bell ringing by government, by scientists on climate change. It's only recently, really, we've had governments starting to take it seriously. And I think we really just are starting to see it. Federally, we're just starting to see it, which is kind of a tenuous situation because that could change with a change of government. But despite hand wringing and alarm bell ringing by scientists, activists, community groups, and others for 30 years, we've had fairly slow uptake. And I just want to say, I'll name three big challenges that are out there that remain. I think one is the opposition to policy change and from large incumbent industries for the most part. First and foremost, the fossil fuel industry. There's exceptions. No offense, Valerie, but I think the financial sector has actually played a role there. And I'm not trying to single out TD in that, but they have, and other sectors as well. And the extent of policy capture that has existed and that remains to this day is huge. I think the growing polarization on these issues, it makes it hard for government to advance. This left of center, right of center divide. Devika was being polite when she said you've got one government that does something, then another government comes in and throws it out. Let's be honest, folks, it is It is, for the most part, either NDP or Liberal governments that enact things, and a Conservative government comes in and throws it out. And we've seen this in Ontario, we've seen it in Alberta. We may very well see it federally, who the heck knows? And it is only in countries where you've seen society actually push politicians to where you no longer have this left of center, right of center divide. And it's only in those societies where you actually see genuine progress on this issue. So in the UK, for example, you don't have the Conservatives, the Tories, and the Labour arguing about whether they should do much on climate change. We still do in some places in Canada, and I think that really needs to change. And then the last challenge I'll say is government has a tendency to work in silos. It's the nature of big bureaucracies. There is no more horizontal issue than climate change. And so even when we've got a government, like let's say federally today, we've got a government that kind of has drunk the Kool-Aid and they get it and they want to do something about it, their siloed nature of departments and the way they think and tackle problems is such a hindrance to actually making significant progress on these files, because it does take a whole of government approach. And we've seen the Trudeau government try with their mandate letters and other things to try to get that horizontalism, but it's just darn tough. And then in terms of the big opportunities for government, I don't know if you probably want me to shut up, Valerie, but I'll just throw out one thing, which really, it'll come back later on, and people have said it, but people often quote Churchill as saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. It turns out it actually wasn't Churchill's quote, and there's no evidence that he actually ever said that, but I think that's true of most attributed quotes, which are misattributed. But the scale of the disruption and crisis that's happening across globally and in Canada from climate change is massive. And experience has shown us, and many of us have kind of campaigned on different sectors over the years, and oceans issues and shipping and mining and forestry and whatever, but it's only when a system is in crisis, when it's in the face of kind of massive disruption, whether it's technological disruption or competitiveness reasons, social disruption, it's only when systems, if systems really stable and kind of happy with the status quo, very hard to change. And I think there's such disruption happening across multiple sectors in Canada right now, and systems that we have, systems of social provisioning, that we have this really neat opportunity to nudge them in the direction that we want them to go, and to harness that disruption. And the worst situation would be that we do let this crisis go to waste, and that from a justice angle, we actually then, sure, we can decarbonize things and reduce our emissions and other things. That may happen, but if we don't at the same time address some of these equity issues, it'll just be a hugely missed opportunity. We have a chance to do it. And we're seeing signs actually of emerging coalitions that I think are fascinating, that really break down silos, and that'll come to a later part of this discussion, where you've got industry, labor, Indigenous organizations, activists, and academics coming together to try to drive change together in a way that we've never seen before.
Well, we are sort of moving along in terms of time. So I didn't know if anybody else on this panel wants to speak to some of the points that Lauren has just made, focused a bit more on government and things, because then we should move to a few questions and get to that before the final wrap up. So just a chance, Devika or Eric or Severn to weigh in on what's just been said. No.
Maybe oh, sorry, Severn, you can say something?
Oh, go, Devika.
Okay.
Go, Devika.
I'll go quick. I just wanted to pick up on the piece about working with Indigenous communities. I think, first, I just want to really elevate what Severn was saying about, it's not just about, reconciliation, reparation, but there is a level of wisdom within Indigenous communities that we need to apply in settler communities to be able to solve the problems. And it goes to what Lauren was saying about, learning how not to work in silos. And I think that it's true, the shift we've seen in conservation with, basically conservation does not happen anymore without IPCAs is a massive, massive shift. But it's also because, there's a recognition that Indigenous communities have access to rights and title that can actually be leveraged for conservation. And the thing that we have to be really, really careful about that I just think is worth talking about is the harm that we are still causing to Indigenous communities in the process of this work. So, you know, it's a big leap, it's a big step forward, but we still have a lot more to do in terms of education and understanding so that we're doing it in ways that are actually truly beneficial and not causing harm to Indigenous communities. That same leap about how it's, you know, it's a strategic move has happened, while it's happened on the conservation side, has not yet happened on the climate side. And I think that that's where we really need to, a lot of education and work is required to help everyone within the movement understand that issues of justice and equity are strategic climate moves, just as they have been on the conservation side. And I just, you know, there's a lot of shifts that I'm seeing, more of an understanding that power building is messy. It's hard to have specific impacts and outcomes that you can kind of tie everything to. People don't get to take credit because it's distributed power and distributed work. But there is a shift. There's a rise in funder collaboratives and trust-based philanthropy. So I think it's you know, moving in the right direction, but slowly, and we still need to be really, really careful about the harm that we're causing.
Severn, did you want to add?
There's so many things to say. You know, Lauren brought up so many great points. It's hard in countries that are petrostates to have not polarized governing situations where you have the swings between governments. And that's something we're definitely facing in Canada, you know, and you can see it. This government has made so many great commitments and at the same time has bought a pipeline and has, you know, committed to expanding offshore oil in the Bay du Nord. And I mean, you know, it's just this kind of like, these double personalities trying to tend to the different interests, and it's not going to result in a climate friendly world, and that's a big part of our problem. And then I couldn't agree more with what Devika said about the need for worldviews as a way out of this, you know. And a friend of mine, his name is Bernard Purley, he's a Maliseet scholar, and he talks about how Indigenous people know how to survive the sixth mass extinction, because for them, it's been happening for the last 500 years. And I think that there's going to come a time when it's the settlers who, again, are begging for help to be able to know or to be taught how to survive the challenges that we're going to be facing with our changing ecology. And we're going to be begging Indigenous people to help us survive once again. And we've got to prepare and change so that we can be respectful and be worthy of getting that help. It's going to get to that point.
Okay, let me get to a couple of questions, and if you can just again bear with this voice. Here's a question. How do we get the message to the corporate world that if we don't commit to sustainability, they won't be able to mitigate future economic collapse? You know, but we also need sustainable solutions that are economically viable. Eric, do you want to touch that, or Lauren, Devika? Put your hand up.
I mean, very quickly, I think the corporate world is often thinking in quarters, right? So they're thinking, okay, the next quarterly report and report back to shareholders. And so I'm generalizing here, don't always have a long-term vision. So I think we need to encourage more companies to have more of a long-term vision. There's an interesting international initiative called the First Movers Coalition, which is a coalition of 50 really large companies. And what they're trying to do is be early adopters in really hard to decarbonize sectors like aluminum, aviation, chemicals, cement, and concrete. So a lot of companies are really thinking long-term. They're not thinking the next quarter, and they're putting their own capital and their own resources and their own thought leadership into it. So that could send a really strong signal to sort of scale zero carbon technologies. So I think there's an important role to play with companies. My personal role with companies is to do shareholder engagement. So I think as a foundation, I can do a lot of engagement with companies to try to be a little bit more ambitious with climate action. I see Lauren raising his hand.
Yeah, I agree with Eric. Interestingly, we find organized labor more forward-looking than many of the sectors that their workers are working in part because capital is quite mobile and labor isn't. So I think labor can play a role actually in shifting corporate attitudes and behavior. But Eric's right. I mean, there are lots of examples of individual companies within their own sectors who really are either driving decarbonization or benefiting from it, often a combination of both. The challenge that they face, and this is something that philanthropy can do something about, and it may sound odd, but the challenge is it's very hard for them to stick their necks out and speak out, to break ranks with their association, and which tend to have a groupthink mentality. And so I think the opportunity is actually to create safe places for some of those progressive companies, those innovators, those early adopters. Some of them are large incumbents, not many of them, but occasionally it happens. I actually think Suncor used to be one of those at one point in a past life. I'm not sure they are today, but that remains to be seen. But there is to create a safe place for those companies to actually come together and speak out. And that safe place isn't just with other companies, it's actually with some of the other groups we're talking about here today, to actually, for their sector, chart a path forward. And it may be that they're just a small group within their sector, but we can actually help foster the spaces where those innovators can actually speak up and actually meet with policymakers in a way that actually, they may get lots of pushback from their large industry associations, but they're actually they're coddled a bit, or they're incubated, and they're supported by civil society, indigenous groups, labor, and others.
Okay, here's a question. As a journalist, every story I write can be a climate story. Sometimes short word counts, quick turnaround make this difficult. How would the panel recommend Canadian journalists integrate climate into the news without just having it be bad news and doom and gloom? Anybody want to just throw their finger up? Thanks, Severn.
I'm thinking a lot about this in the context of thinking about David Suzuki and being on air for 44 years with the nature of things. And I think we're at a different point now. We know that climate change is here, and it's, because of all of the efforts of climate activists and advocates in the media and in educational spaces and scientists who are speaking out, is all of that. And the media needs to make up for, I think, a prolonged period where the media actively promoted the idea that climate change was still a debate in the scientific community. So this is a great question. Thank you so much. I think we need to focus on the solutions, because there are so many things that are happening right now. And, the media loves to focus on disaster and doom and gloom, and David Suzuki loves that too. So I'm constantly, as someone who myself, I'm very aware, I feel very anxious about climate. I feel so empowered and inspired when I see what other people and communities are doing. And so I've been thinking about this also in context of the nature of things. My sister, Sarika Suzuki, wrote and hosted a show called True Survivors. And in this show, she goes on a journey as a parent looking to how we're going to survive this climate crisis. And in fact, she finds out that there's all these examples in history and right now in ways humans have navigated crisis and have found ways to survive. And in Canada, we have so many Indigenous communities, but other communities too, who have huge solar panel arrays, who have wind farms, who are investing in micro hydro, and essentially are figuring out how to adapt and how to survive. And it is, it's so inspiring to see examples of people just rolling up their sleeves and doing it, not waiting for the government or for institutions or for funding. They're just doing it. And one example I'll just close with is in Kanakabar here in BC. It's a First Nation right beside the town of Lytton. That was the community that in 2021 burned to the ground after breaking Canada's records for hottest place ever recorded. And Kanakabar right next door, they were so prepared. They're one of the safest places in Canada because they listened to the climate experts, put in the culverts, the micro hydro, they're growing their own food. They're so prepared. And those kinds of examples are just, they show us how to do it. And that's what we got to do. So that's what I would focus on, all those examples, and build that vision and that movement.
Okay, a minute, Eric, and then we'll get one more question in.
Yeah, I just 100% agree. So like focus on positive stories, the doom and gloom, people end up tuning out. And then they're wondering, what can I do? What's the solution? And so focusing on, the just transition in Alberta, like folks are going from the oil sands and installing solar and wind, and there's new jobs, the really cool clean tech companies that Canada is really leading on. Heat pump installation, maybe it's not the sexiest topic with buildings, but these are really concrete solutions. So that's what people love. And I wish the media focused a little bit more on some of those really good positive stories.
Okay, one more question, short answer if possible, because we want final thoughts from you guys. This is a question about AI and the role of AI in the fight against climate change. I don't know, any of you would stick your hand up, finger up, if you have thoughts on that.
Other than that, we're all terrified. I bet there's not a really coherent answer.
That's it, terrified of just its role in changing society, or?
Yeah, I think it has the ability, it could either kind of spread truth or spread misinformation, or at least arm the forces of misinformation. And so I think if AI becomes a force for truth, then I think it has a chance of being quite helpful. And I think the jury is still out. And I think a lot of that will depend on the platforms themselves, who builds them, the interface between people. But it's potentially quite terrifying.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to say, like this speaks to this. There are some things, technological advances that have not been governed or monitored, and they're not being directed in service of humanity.
Yeah.
They're just kind of happening and unfolding. And we haven't addressed social media, but the erosion of democracy due to social media is a huge thing, and misinformation and how people relate to facts. I mean, that is a huge complex that we are dealing with, even as we're trying to advance things that are good for humanity. But these technological realities and advancements without any kind of limits or value system are a huge challenge to us surviving as a species. And
Hear, hear.
Indeed. So as we look to wrap up, and again, I'll just keep your thoughts to a couple of minutes each, but to get back to all of you again, what final thoughts you have, the one message I think that you would like to underscore or make sure that people understand from you. And I'll start with Devika.
Thanks. So I think, I very much agree with what's been said about focusing on solutions and all the cool things that are happening in communities. But I think that the other fundamental, sort of the elephant in the room that we have to tackle if we have any hope of getting out of this crisis is that our current economic model does not serve the well-being of the majority of the people who make it up. And so, a model that is based on continuous extractive growth, where externalities are not priced, where, we measure shareholder returns and GDP, and where wealth is really allowed to accumulate in the hands of just a few people rather than taxed and distributed back to society, makes, that is the inherent root cause that's related to all of what we're talking about. Climate change is just a symptom of that issue. And so, we can get excited about solutions, and we can talk about how do we get, the corporate sector to do more, but the corporate sector is just doing what they're supposed to do within our current economic model, right? Their job is ultimately growth and profit. And I've heard all kinds of stories of corporate leaders begging government behind closed doors, please regulate us, please create, an even playing field so that within the, so it's fair for everybody so that we can advance solutions. Without regulation and policy and taxation to have the capital that we need to take all these really cool solutions and scale them to the degree that they need to be, without tackling those root issues, we're not going to solve these problems. So I don't want us to ever lose sight of the forest for the trees. and that economic system and the wealth that exists but needs to be redirected, and the rules that need to be changed primarily through regulation need to be like, our highest level focus.
Okay, thank you. Eric.
Yeah, just quickly to add to that, Senator Rosa Galvez is pushing the Climate Aligned Finance Act, which is aiming to do exactly that. So my call to action for those 112 people listening today is put some pressure in Ottawa and get CAFA bill adopted, because it's going to solve a lot of the challenges that we're facing in the financial sector. Look, I think we're in a climate crisis, and to use Catherine McKenna's terms, let's use all hands on deck. Funders like ourselves or Ivy and others, we really need to start adopting or continue adopting a climate justice lens within our work and ensuring that communities of color are integrated and not left aside. But we also need to be funding more grassroots work. So the grassroots funding is very, very limited in Canada. Our foundation was fortunate with the David Suzuki Foundation's help in Quebec years ago to help provide some support for Greta and about 500,000 protesters that came to the streets in Montreal. So we need more funders to do that. We need probably like some rapid response emergency fund that just helps support small grassroots organizations with diverse opinions and from diverse communities. But unfortunately, we're not seeing that level of commitment from the philanthropic sector. That's my call of action to foundations. And then just lastly, it's worth remembering that we're seeing some Indigenous communities doing some really amazing work in Canada by removing diesel off their grids. So they're reducing their consumption of diesel, and they're adopting solar or they're adopting wind. And this is creating local employment. It's making the air healthier, and ultimately, it's allowing greater self-empowerment and sovereignty. And these are all sort of stories that we should be sharing more often, and we should be embracing, and we should really be trying to scale. And often enough, we're not focusing enough on these positive stories.
Okay, we're getting a little short. So Severin, if you can take a minute for your message.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, I agree so much with especially Devika's last statement. The economic system needs to change. It's thrilling to be here in this forum where we're openly talking about this in this kind of a webinar. So thanks everyone. And justice in this regard, in the economic system, injustice is becoming clearer and clearer for a huge majority. It's clear the system's not working, and it's just so clear around fossil fuel supremacy. I mean, with fossil fuel industries raking in profits hand over foot, getting subsidies to the tune of $11 million a minute worldwide. That is the story. I think we also need to grow what's working. Now we're at a point, 2023, where we have all the solutions. They're all here. We don't have to wait. We know how to do this. So we just have to scale up, grow that, focus on that. And finally, we have to really promote the reality that humans are not destroying the world. One mindset is destroying the world. One mindset of colonialism, capitalism, supremacy. This is really set the stage for fossil fuel supremacy. But we as human beings, if we really embrace diversity and inclusion, we actually are the solution.
Thank you. All right, Lauren, I'll give you a minute.
Please. Two things. I think philanthropy needs to get far more comfortable with funding stuff that they're uncomfortable with. And that includes pointy stick work, protest work, pressure on governments, pressure on industry, calling out villainy, whatever you want to call it. We don't like to fund that work, and it's fundamentally needed. And so I think that's one thing I'd just wrap by saying. And then I want to put two plugs, on opportunities. One is around electrification. Somebody mentioned DSF's report. There's many of them out there over the years as well that call for a doubling, if not a tripling, of electricity supply. So there's that opportunity, and the other one is around critical minerals. And to me, the opportunity is, first of all, there is one of the groups we support funded a report or did a report a few years ago that said, it was titled "All Roads to Net Zero Run Through Indigenous Lands." And it's absolutely true. And I tell you, there is no extracting critical minerals, nor is there any doubling of our electricity supply without strong Indigenous leadership. And that requires an investment in Indigenous capacity. And I think it's both an opportunity economically, and the risk of us not doing it is massive.
All right. Well done, close. So I'm going to thank you all so much for being with us again. It's been fascinating and wonderful to listen to you. And we thank our sponsor, TD Bank Group. So we appreciate them and the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Greater Toronto Chapter, Canada Helps, Imagine Canada, Community Foundations of Canada, and the Canadian Association of Gift Planners for being part of this and pulling this together. And to TMU for doing this. And thanks for people who submitted their questions. So we appreciate your attendance, and there'll be another one of these May 15th on City Building, and you'll probably have a host interviewer who has a voice. So that's something to look forward to. Anyway, very much appreciate you being with us today, and thank you all so much. Cheers.